My name is Solomon Fairfax. I was 51 years old when they put the rope around my neck, and I climbed those steps with steadier hands than the men who built the gallows. Before you decide what kind of man I was, let me tell you what kind of men they were. 9 of them. Pillars of the church, judges, slave owners, men who laughed while they tore my family apart like old bread, children sold east, a wife left bleeding in the mud, a life of healing twisted into something they will never have a name for. I did not lose my mind. I sharpened it. I did not reach for a weapon. I reached for something far more precise. What I did in those years between losing everything and climbing those steps, that is what this story is about. And I promise you, by the time I finish telling it, you will understand why I have no regrets. There is a magnolia tree still standing on the old Pemberton land. Beneath its roots, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with river wax, they found my diary 70 years after they buried me. The men who dug said the ground felt wrong, too cold for summer, too still for a place with birds singing overhead. When they opened those 9 coffins, they saw the scratches, deep gouges in the wood from the inside, fingernails. The newspapers called it horror. I call it honesty. I gave those men the only truth they had ever been forced to feel, what it is to be trapped inside a body that belongs to someone else, with no voice, no mercy, and no way out. If that troubles your heart, good. It should. Because before I tell you what I did, I need you to understand what was done to me first. And if this story is already touching something deep inside you, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and God knows it helps put food on my family's table. Now, let me take you back to the morning everything changed. The Pemberton plantation sat low in the South Carolina lowlands, where the air never fully dried, and the moss hung from the oaks like funeral shrouds. I can still feel the weight of that humidity, the way it pressed against your chest before sunrise, before the bells rang, before the world reminded you again of what you were. The cabin sat in a crooked row behind the main house, close enough that the smell of their kitchen fires reached us, far enough that our suffering never disturbed their supper. The soil was dark and rich and cruel. It grew everything: cotton, indigo, sorrow. At night, the frogs sang so loud you could almost forget where you were. Almost. But then the morning came, gray and indifferent, and the land showed you its true face again. I learned every inch of that place. The soft mud near the creek where a man could move without sound. The hollow oak where I hid my notes. The path behind the smokehouse where nobody watched. I learned it the way a prisoner learns his cell. Carefully, completely, with purpose. For 30 years I was the healer. That was my role, my identity, my only armor. I rose before the others and moved through the quarters with my leather bag, roots, poultices, needle and thread, whatever I had managed to collect or barter for. I set broken bones on the same table where men ate their one meal of the day. I brought children into the world in rooms with dirt floors and no light. I sat beside the dying and held their hands so they would not leave alone. The white men called me useful. That word, useful. I learned to hate it the way you hate a chain that fits too well. It meant I had value only as a function, not as a man, not as a father, not as a husband. But I used that usefulness. I studied everything Dr. Hathaway left within reach. His Latin texts, his botanical references, his anatomy drawings. I read by firelight, by moonlight, by whatever light I could find. I was building something even then. I just did not yet know what shape it would take. The wound I carried was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with screaming or fire. It was quiet, like a splinter buried too deep to see but impossible to ignore. I had built something real inside that broken place, a family. Celia and I had found each other the way desperate people find warmth, instinctively, without asking permission. Marcus was 17, already broad-shouldered and serious. Samuel was 14, always watching the horizon. Grace was 8 years old and called me Papa with a voice so sweet it made the mornings bearable. I had managed to keep them together for years through careful maneuvering, staying indispensable, staying quiet, staying useful. But I always knew, in the place where honest men keep their honest fears, that it could end on any morning, that any sunrise could be the last one we shared. I prayed it would not be. I bargained with God and with silence. I made myself smaller and more valuable every single day, and still, it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. That is the wound. Knowing the worst is coming and being unable to stop it. It was a gray Tuesday morning in March of 1851, when the world I had built with my bare hands was taken apart in less than an hour. I remember the cold, unusual for that time of year in Carolina, the kind of cold that feels like a warning. I heard the horses before I saw them. 2 men from the Dalton estate riding slow and deliberate up the main road with papers folded in their breast pockets. Pemberton met them on the porch with coffee and a handshake. I watched from the tree line, my bag in my hand, my feet already understanding what my mind refused to accept. They called the names. Marcus first, then Samuel, then Grace. My children walked out of the cabin in the clothes they had slept in, Grace still holding the small corn-husk doll I had made her the previous Christmas. Nobody asked them anything. Nobody explained anything. They were loaded onto a flatbed wagon like furniture being relocated. Celia ran. She made it perhaps 40 feet before they caught her. They left her in the mud of the road, bleeding from her mouth, deemed no longer worth the paperwork. I did not move. I could not. I stood behind that tree line and I watched all of it. Every single second. I've been asked many times, by the journalist Grimby, by the court, by the preacher they sent to my cell, why I did not fight that morning. Why I did not throw myself at those men and die defending my family. The honest answer is this. I thought about it. For the span of about 4 breaths, I calculated the geometry of violence. 2 armed men, open ground, no allies, no chance. And then something shifted inside me. Something went very quiet and very cold. Fighting that morning would have given them exactly what they wanted. A dead black man and a clean conscience. I chose differently. I chose to live. Not out of cowardice. I want you to understand that clearly. But out of something more dangerous than courage. I chose patience. I knelt beside Celia in the mud and I pressed my hands against her face. And I made her a promise in a voice so low that only God and the dirt could hear it. I told her that what had been done to our children would not go unanswered. I told her that I would find a way. I did not yet know what that way looked like. But I knew, with the certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose, that I would find it. Celia died 11 days later. Infection. The wound had gone too deep, and I had too little to work with. I held her hand through the last night, listening to her breathing slow the way a fire slows when the wood runs out. By morning, she was gone. They buried her in the unmarked field behind the south pasture, where they put the ones who were no longer useful. I dug the grave myself. I marked it with a flat stone and a carved cross, because they would not give her a proper one. And when I stood over that ground in the early morning light, something completed itself inside me. The grief was real. Do not mistake my stillness for absence of feeling. But alongside the grief, something else had been growing since the morning on the road. A plan. Clear and cold and precise as surgical steel. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Hathaway arrived at Pemberton looking for a skilled medical assistant. Pemberton sold me to him for $140. He thought he was getting a bargain. He had no idea what he was bringing into his house. Charleston was a different kind of cage. Cleaner walls, softer chains, but a cage nonetheless. Dr. Hathaway's office sat on a quiet street lined with magnolias and iron fences. The kind of street where gentlemen tipped their hats and ladies carried parasols, and nobody spoke above a polite murmur. I was given a small room behind the surgery, a canvas cot, a single candle. In exchange, I prepared his instruments, compounded his medicines, assisted in procedures that his white colleagues would have paid handsomely to observe. He was not a cruel man. That was the strange part. He spoke to me almost as an equal inside those four walls. But the moment a visitor arrived, I became invisible. Furniture. A very capable piece of furniture. I used that invisibility the way I had used everything else. Carefully, intentionally. I cataloged every substance in that office. Every root, every resin, every powder imported from the Caribbean and South America. I cross-referenced his Latin text with what the old healers back at Pemberton had taught me about plants the white doctors had never bothered to study. I was looking for something specific, and in the 3rd month I found it. There were nights when I sat with that small candle burning low and asked myself the question that I suspect you are asking right now. Was I becoming the very thing I hated? I turned that question over in my hands like a stone, examining every surface. The men who destroyed my family had never lost a moment of sleep over what they did. They sat in church pews on Sundays and sang hymns with clean consciences. The law protected them. The church blessed them. Society rewarded them. There was no court I could walk into, no complaint I could file, no authority I could appeal to that would hear my name as anything other than a piece of property making noise. Justice, for men like me, did not exist inside any institution built by men like them. So I asked myself a different question. Not whether what I was planning was evil, but whether the world that made it necessary had any right to judge me for it. I thought about Marcus, about Samuel, about Grace carrying that corn-husked doll onto a wagon in the cold morning. And the question answered itself. I slept better after that. That troubled me at first. Then it stopped troubling me entirely. The vine was called by different names in different places. The traders who brought it from the Amazon basin called it by a word I will not attempt to reproduce here. What mattered was its chemistry. Administered correctly in precise doses, I spent 4 months calculating. It produced complete muscular paralysis within 40 minutes of ingestion. The heart continued. The lungs continued, shallowly, imperceptibly. The eyes could move slightly if the subject fought hard enough. But to any physician conducting a standard examination of that era, the presentation was indistinguishable from death. Body temperature dropped. Pulse became undetectable without instruments that most doctors did not own. Reflexes vanished entirely. I tested the dosage on rats first, then on a dying mule whose suffering I was already managing. I calibrated it with the same precision I had applied to every medical problem in 30 years of practice. Too little and the paralysis was incomplete, detectable. Too much and the paralysis became permanent. The corridor between those two outcomes was narrow, but I found it. And once I found it, I walked through it without hesitation. The first name on my list was Colonel Randolph Fitzpatrick. He had been present the morning my children were taken, standing on Pemberton's porch, laughing at something the Dalton men said. His boot resting on the porch rail with the casual comfort of a man who has never once feared the morning. He suffered from gout, which brought him to Dr. Hathaway's office every 6 weeks with the predictability of a church clock. I prepared his tonic personally. Hathaway trusted my compounding completely by that point. I had given him no reason not to. I added the preparation to the tonic with the steadiness of hands that had sewn 1,000 wounds. When Fitzpatrick came in, red-faced and loud as always, I handed him the glass myself. He did not look at me. They never looked at me. 3 days later, they found him in his study, seated upright in his chair, eyes open, apparently dead of cardiac failure. The county physician signed the certificate without removing the man's boots. I read the death notice in Hathaway's discarded newspaper, and I felt nothing except the quiet satisfaction of precise work executed correctly. That sensation frightened me less than I expected it to. By the fourth name, I understood something about fear that I had not anticipated. Not my own fear. I had made peace with dying the morning Celia stopped breathing. I mean the fear of the men around me. Charleston's elite had begun to notice a pattern. 4 prominent men, healthy, wealthy, powerful, had died suddenly and without obvious cause within 8 months. Doctors were being questioned. Families were demanding explanations. The air in Hathaway's office changed. He became distracted, anxious, prone to long silences over his dinner. He started locking cabinets he had previously left open. I watched all of this with the calm attention of a man who has already decided how his story ends. But there was one moment, one single crack in my composure, when I passed the orphanage on Meeting Street and saw, through the iron fence, a little girl of perhaps 8 years old carrying a homemade doll. She had Grace's walk, that same careful, deliberate step, like the ground might give way. I stopped walking. I pressed my hand flat against the iron fence until the cold of it anchored me back into my body. Then I continued on. There were 5 names remaining. The revelation did not come from outside. It came from inside a leather-bound book I found tucked behind a false panel in Hathaway's private cabinet, the one he had started locking. I was not searching for it. I was compounding a preparation late on a Wednesday evening when the panel shifted under my elbow and the book slid forward into the candlelight. It was a ledger. Names, dates, amounts paid. And there, repeated across 14 separate transactions spanning 11 years, was a name I recognized with the particular violence of a wound reopening. Hathaway himself. He had not simply purchased me from Pemberton. He had been part of a consortium, 7 men, including 3 already on my list, who had systematically coordinated the separation of skilled enslaved families across 4 counties. The purpose was deliberate. Keeping families together created loyalty, solidarity, resistance. Separating them created isolation and compliance. My children had not been sold because Pemberton needed money. They had been sold because these men had decided, in a meeting I was never meant to know about, that my family represented a specific kind of danger. They had studied us. They had planned it. They had signed their names to it in clean, careful handwriting. I sat with that ledger in my hands for a long time. The candle burned down to its last inch. Outside, Charleston moved through its ordinary evening. Carriages on cobblestone, distant music from a supper club 2 streets over, the sound of the harbor bell marking the hour. And inside that small room, everything I thought I understood about my own story rearranged itself into a sharper, colder truth. I had believed, in some private corner of my grief, that what happened to my family was the casual cruelty of indifferent men, bad luck wearing a human face. The ledger destroyed that mercy. It had been a decision, deliberate, documented, and shared among men who then shook hands and went home to their families. Hathaway had sat across from me for 2 years, watching me compound his medicines, trusting my hands with his patience, occasionally speaking to me with something resembling respect, all while carrying the knowledge of what he had helped orchestrate. That realization did not make me angrier. I'd passed through anger long ago. It made me extraordinarily calm. It also added one name to my list that had not been there before. I sat with 2 choices through the longest night of my life. The first was to disappear. I had the knowledge, the contacts along the northern routes, the medical skills that could buy passage and silence from the right people. I could have been in Philadelphia within 3 weeks, a free man by geography, if not by law, building something new from whatever remained of me. The second choice required no travel at all. 3 names remained on my list. Hathaway was now among them. Walking away meant those men continued their lives undisturbed, continued attending their church services, continued signing their ledgers, continued making their careful, documented decisions about which families deserved to remain whole and which did not. I thought about Marcus. I thought about Samuel. I thought about Grace and her doll, and the cold March morning and the flatbed wagon disappearing down the road. And then I thought about every other father who had stood behind a tree line watching the same scene, with the same paralyzed hands and the same silent promise made into the mud. I was not only acting for myself. I understood that clearly in the gray hours before dawn. I was acting for every man who had made that promise and had no means to keep it. I chose to stay. I want to be precise about what that decision revealed to me, because I have had years, first in my cell, then in whatever comes after, to examine it honestly. It did not reveal that I was righteous. Righteous men do not do what I did with the steadiness I did it. It revealed that I had crossed, somewhere between Celia's grave and Hathaway's ledger, a line that most men spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. Not the line between good and evil. That boundary is far more complicated than the preachers suggest, and I suspect most of them know it. I mean the line between bearing your suffering and deciding that the world producing that suffering must be directly answered. I crossed it with full knowledge and no hesitation. What I found on the other side was not peace exactly, but it was something close to purpose. A terrible, clear, irreversible purpose. The remaining 3 men would receive the same careful attention I had given the first 6. Hathaway would be last. I wanted him to read the death notices. I wanted him to feel in those final weeks the particular helplessness of watching something inevitable approach and being unable to stop it. I wanted him to know before the end exactly how that feels. It was Thomas Grimby who unraveled it. A journalist, young, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who notices the things that polite society trains itself not to see. He had been quietly investigating the deaths for months, following a thread that the authorities had dismissed as coincidence. He found me on a Thursday evening in Henderson's office, where I had arranged the final three: Judge Calverton, Merchant Hargrove, and Hathaway himself, seated around the supper table in their paralyzed stillness, candles burning, glasses poured, a scene of such deliberate symmetry that it stopped Grimby in the doorway like a physical force. He stood there for a long moment, lantern in hand, looking at those three frozen faces, eyes open, chests barely moving, trapped completely inside their own bodies. Then he looked at me. I was seated at the head of the table. I had been waiting. I told him what the preparation was, how it worked, how long they had remaining before it metabolized and they regained movement. I told him about the ledger. I told him about the flatbed wagon and Grace's doll and Celia bleeding in the mud. I spoke quietly and without theater, the way you explain a medical procedure to a colleague. When I finished, Grimby did not speak for a very long time. Then he asked me if I was a monster. I told him I was a mirror. And I told him to send for the physician and the sheriff, in that order. They tried me in 4 days. The ledger was entered as evidence, but generated considerably less outrage than my actions. Hathaway testified from a wheeled chair, his hands still trembling from residual effects of the preparation, his voice steady enough, his eyes unable to quite meet mine across the courtroom. Calverton and Hargrove recovered fully and sat in the gallery throughout the proceedings with the righteous indignation of men who have never once considered that their comfort rested on a foundation of documented cruelty. The verdict was never in question. I was sentenced to hang on the 15th of October, 1853. In my cell during those final weeks, I completed the diary. Every name, every dosage, every date, every entry from the ledger copied in my own hand. I wrapped it in oilcloth, sealed it with river wax, and gave it to Grimby with one instruction: bury it under the magnolia on the old Pemberton land and leave it for the world that comes after. The world I believed, with the faith of a man who has nothing left but faith, would eventually be different enough to understand it. Grimby kept his word. 70 years later, they found it exactly where he left it. The scratches on those 9 coffin lids had long since told their own story to the earth. I climbed those steps on a cold October morning with the steadiness of a man who has finished his work. The rope was coarse against my neck. I noticed the texture the way a surgeon notices details. Out of habit, out of the discipline of a lifetime spent paying attention to the physical world. Below me, a small crowd had gathered. I did not look for friendly faces because I did not expect any. What I found instead, in those final seconds, was something I had not anticipated. Clarity. Not peace exactly. Not triumph. Clarity. I had not saved my children. I had not brought Celia back. I had not dismantled the system that produced the ledger and the flatbed wagon in the cold March morning. 3 men from my original list had died of natural causes before I reached them, and I carried that incompleteness with me to the end. But I had answered something. I had taken the silence that the world assigned to men like me, that long, enforced, weaponized silence, and I had filled it with something they could not ignore, could not explain away, and could not forget. in the memory of those who finally chose to hear him.